I'm 27 years old, the eldest of two daughters. My younger sister, Emily, is 24, and we've always had a close but complicated bond. Growing up, Emily was the dreamer of the family, always envisioning grandeur, while I tended to keep my feet firmly on the ground. Our parents have always worked hard to give us everything they could, but money was never something we had in excess. Recently, Emily got engaged to her long-term boyfriend, someone the whole family adores. The engagement announcement was met with joy and celebration. It was no surprise when Emily started talking about her wedding almost immediately. She'd been planning it in her mind for years, imagining the perfect dress, the perfect venue, and every detail in between. At first, it was heartwarming to see her excitement. Our parents were thrilled too and quickly offered to help financially. That's just who they are, generous to a fault, always putting their children first. They assured Emily that they would do whatever it took to give her the wedding she deserved. As the weeks went on, Emily began sharing more and more of her vision. She talked about a destination wedding on a tropical beach, a lavish reception with hundreds of guests, and a designer dress that would make her feel like royalty. Each idea was more extravagant than the last. Though I shared her enthusiasm at first, I started to feel a twinge of concern. My parents, though willing, weren't exactly in a position to comfortably fund a wedding like this. But I kept these thoughts to myself, not wanting to dampen the excitement. After all, a wedding is a once-in-a-lifetime event, and Emily deserves her moment. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this was going to be harder than any of us expected. The engagement celebration was a cozy family dinner at our parents' house. It was just the four of us, seated around the dining table where so many of our memories had been made. Emily was glowing with happiness, her engagement ring catching the light as she gestured animatedly while describing the proposal. She recounted how her fiancé, Ryan, had popped the question during a romantic weekend getaway. We all listened, captivated by the details, from the candlelit dinner to the heartfelt speech he gave before getting down on one knee. My parents were beaming with pride and joy, their love for Emily shining as brightly as her ring. As we toasted to their future, the conversation naturally shifted to wedding plans. Emily was quick to jump in with ideas, her excitement bubbling over. "I've always dreamed of a tropical beach wedding," she said, her eyes lighting up. She painted a vivid picture of a pristine white sand beach, a sunset ceremony, and a reception under twinkling fairy lights. My parents immediately chimed in with their support. "Whatever you need, we're here for you," my dad said, squeezing her hand. My mom nodded, already offering suggestions for venues and vendors. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and for a moment, I was swept up in it too. Emily talked about how she wanted her wedding to be unique and unforgettable, and no expense seemed too great in her mind. She even joked about hiring a live band to fly in for the reception. My parents laughed, but I noticed the briefest flicker of unease pass over my dad's face. As the evening wound down, I couldn't help but feel a mix of happiness for Emily and a nagging worry about the road ahead. In the days following the engagement dinner, Emily's wedding ideas evolved from whimsical dreams to full-blown plans. Every conversation with her revolved around intricate details, some so extravagant that I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. She talked about her venue of choice, a luxury beachfront resort in a tropical destination. "Imagine the photos," she said, scrolling through glossy pictures on her phone. The white sand, turquoise waters, and exotic flowers made for a stunning backdrop. It was hard to argue against how beautiful it all looked. Then came the dress. Emily had her heart set on a custom designer gown, something she described as timeless yet unforgettable. When she casually mentioned the price range, more than the cost of my car, I nearly choked on my coffee. "But it's my wedding dress," she said, brushing off my reaction. "It has to be perfect." Her plans didn't stop there. She envisioned a reception with gourmet catering, an open bar, and a live band flown in from out of state. Each detail seemed more ambitious than the last, and the price tags added up quickly in my mind. As excited as she was, I couldn't ignore the growing concerns. Our parents had pledged to help financially, but it was clear that Emily's dream wedding would stretch their resources thin. My dad was already talking about dipping into savings, and my mom casually mentioned cutting back on other expenses to make it work. I brought it up gently during one of our conversations, suggesting that maybe she could simplify a few things to make the costs more manageable. Her reaction was swift and defensive. "This is my one chance to have the wedding I've always dreamed of," she said. "Why should I settle?" Her determination to make every detail perfect left little room for compromise. I started to feel caught in a growing tension, excited for her happiness, yet uneasy about the strain it was putting on everyone around her. As Emily's plans grew more elaborate, the strain on my parents became more apparent. At first, they were all smiles, encouraging her to follow her dreams and assuring her that they'd handle the costs. But behind those smiles, I began to notice signs of worry. My dad, who usually approached finances with caution, started making offhand comments about dipping into their retirement savings. "We'll manage," he said one evening, though his tone betrayed a hint of uncertainty. My mom, who prides herself on budgeting, began quietly reworking their monthly expenses, cutting corners wherever she could. I found myself caught between wanting to support Emily's vision and feeling protective of my parents. They've always gone above and beyond for us, but this felt different. A destination wedding wasn't just an expense. It was a financial commitment that could have lasting consequences. During one family dinner, I casually asked how much they were planning to spend on the wedding. My dad gave a nonchalant shrug, but my mom hesitated. "We haven't set a firm budget yet," she said. "But it's Emily's special day. We want to make it unforgettable." That answer didn't sit well with me. I pressed further, asking if they'd considered what sacrifices might be necessary to fund such a grand event. My mom brushed it off, saying they'd figure it out. "You only get married once," she added with a smile. Emily, oblivious to the undercurrents, continued to dream out loud. She talked about flying in all her friends, renting private villas for the bridal party, and even hiring a professional fireworks display for the reception. Each idea felt more unattainable than the last. I tried to approach the topic delicately with Emily, suggesting that maybe she could tone down certain aspects to make things easier for everyone. She waved me off, insisting that our parents were happy to help. Her confidence in their ability to fund her dream made me realize just how disconnected she was from the reality of the situation. It wasn't long before Emily's enthusiasm spilled over into new territory. She started hinting at how I might help out with her wedding. At first, I didn't think much of it. We were sitting in the living room after dinner, scrolling through Pinterest boards of wedding decor, when she casually mentioned it. "You're so good with planning," she said, nudging me playfully. "Maybe you could help me organize a few things, to take some stress off Mom and Dad." I nodded, thinking she meant tasks like picking out centerpieces or managing RSVPs. That felt natural. I wanted to support her and be part of her big day. It was the kind of thing a sister would do without question. But her hint started becoming more pointed. "I've been looking at these amazing photographers," she said one evening, flipping her phone screen toward me. "It's a little pricey, but the pictures would be incredible. Maybe you could chip in? As a wedding gift." I smiled awkwardly, not sure how to respond. Contributing financially hadn't even crossed my mind. I'd only recently started a new job, and between paying off student loans and building my savings, I was still getting my footing. When I mentioned this, Emily didn't seem fazed. "It doesn't have to be much," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Just think about it." The conversation left me unsettled. I wasn't opposed to helping, but I couldn't shake the feeling that her expectations were growing faster than anyone could reasonably keep up with. Still, I didn't say anything more. I told myself that she was just caught up in the excitement and that it would all work itself out. The hint soon turned into a direct ask. Emily and I were having lunch at a cafe when she brought it up again, this time more seriously. She leaned forward, her tone soft but deliberate. "I've been thinking," she said, stirring her latte. "You know how Mom and Dad are covering a lot of the costs for the wedding? I was wondering if you could help too." I blinked, unsure of what to say. "Help how?" I asked cautiously. "Well," she began, "there are a few things I'd really love to include, but don't want to put too much pressure on Mom and Dad. Like the photographer. Maybe part of the dress, or even the flowers. She smiled as if she were asking for something simple. I hesitated, trying to process the request. Emily, I love you, and I want to support you, but I'm not exactly in a position to contribute like that. I'm still paying off student loans, and I've just started saving for my own future. Her expression shifted, the brightness dimming. I get that, she said, her voice tinged with disappointment. But this is my wedding, my one special day. I thought you'd want to be part of making it amazing. I do, I said quickly. But there's a difference between being supportive and taking on financial responsibility I can't handle. She frowned, leaning back in her chair. It's not like I'm asking you to pay for the whole thing, she said defensively. Just a little to help. Everyone else seems willing to make sacrifices for this. But you're acting like it's such a big deal. I could feel the conversation shifting into tense territory. I explained again that it wasn't about not wanting to help. It was about what I could reasonably afford. But her disappointment was clear, and I left the cafe feeling like I'd failed her in some way. It was the first time I started to question if my boundaries were being misunderstood as selfishness. After the conversation at the cafe, I found myself replaying it in my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that Emily didn't fully understand where I was coming from. Maybe I hadn't explained myself well enough, or maybe she just didn't want to hear it. My financial reality wasn't glamorous, but it was mine to manage. I'd recently landed a new job that paid decently, but I was still finding my footing. The burden of student loans loomed large, a monthly reminder of the years I'd spent working toward my degree. On top of that, I had other goals: saving for an emergency fund, building a retirement account, and hopefully one day affording my own place. I wasn't in dire straits by any means, but I also wasn't in a position to spend lavishly, even for something as important as Emily's wedding. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the principle. I had worked hard to get where I was, and going into debt or sacrificing my own stability didn't feel like the right way to support her. I tried to imagine how I could contribute without overextending myself. Maybe I could help with smaller items or offer my time and energy instead of money. But even that didn't seem to satisfy Emily's expectations. The hardest part was feeling like I was letting her down. I loved Emily, and the last thing I wanted was to create tension during what should be one of the happiest times of her life. But I also couldn't ignore the little voice in my head urging me to stand my ground. I told myself that being firm didn't mean I didn't care. It meant I was being realistic. Still, it was hard to shake the guilt. Emily's disappointment turned into frustration faster than I expected. After my attempt to explain my financial situation, she seemed to interpret it as an excuse rather than a valid reason. A few days after our cafe conversation, she brought it up again, this time more pointedly. We were sitting in my apartment, flipping through a wedding magazine, when she suddenly closed it with a snap and looked at me. "I just don't get it," she said. "How can you not want to help more? You're my sister." Her words stung. "It's not that I don't want to help," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "I just can't afford to do what you're asking. I'm already juggling my own expenses." "But it's not like I'm asking you to pay for the whole wedding," she countered. "Just a few things. I thought family was supposed to support each other." I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Emily, I love you, and I want you to have an amazing wedding. But support doesn't always mean money. I can help in other ways, planning, organizing, anything you need. But I can't give what I don't have." She crossed her arms, her face a mix of hurt and anger. "You're being selfish," she said quietly. "You don't care about how much this means to me." That accusation hit me hard. I'd always been there for Emily, through every milestone and challenge. The idea that she saw me as unsupportive felt like a punch to the gut. "I do care," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "But I also have to take care of myself. If I go into debt over this, what kind of support will I be able to offer in the long run?" The conversation ended in a tense silence. Emily left soon after, and I sat alone in my apartment, questioning whether I'd handled it the right way. Her words replayed in my head, making me wonder if I was being selfish, or if I was just finally setting boundaries. The tension between Emily and me came to a head during a family dinner not long after our argument. What started as a pleasant evening quickly spiraled into a heated discussion that left everyone on edge. Emily had been talking about a new venue she'd fallen in love with, a secluded beach resort that would require flying in all the guests. My parents, ever the cheerleaders, nodded along, but I could see the faint lines of worry on my dad's face. When Emily mentioned the astronomical cost of securing the spot, I couldn't hold back any longer. "Emily," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "don't you think this is getting a little out of hand? It sounds amazing, but maybe it's time to consider scaling back a bit." The room went quiet, and all eyes turned to me. Emily's face flushed with irritation. "Why are you always so negative about this?" she shot back. "It's my wedding, not yours. If you don't want to support me, just say so." "I'm not being negative," I said firmly. "I'm being realistic. Mom and Dad are already stretching themselves thin to make this happen. And now you're asking me to contribute too. It feels like you're expecting everyone else to pay for your dream." That was the moment the conversation exploded. Emily accused me of being jealous and unsupportive, claiming I didn't understand how important this day was to her. I fired back, pointing out how inconsiderate it was to demand so much from people who loved her. My parents tried to mediate, but it only made things worse. My dad asked me to be more understanding, while my mom pleaded for everyone to calm down. The dinner ended with Emily storming out and me sitting in silence, feeling both angry and drained. As I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed some invisible line, but part of me also felt a sense of clarity. I wasn't wrong for standing up for what I believed in, even if it meant creating waves. After the explosive dinner, my parents called me the next day, hoping to smooth things over. I could hear the tension in my mom's voice as she asked me to come over for a talk. Reluctantly, I agreed, knowing this conversation was inevitable. We sat in the living room, the same space where we'd celebrated countless family milestones. My dad started, his tone calm but firm. "Look, we know things got heated last night, but we need to find a way to move forward." "I understand that," I said, "but I don't think it's fair for Emily to expect so much from everyone. It's a wedding, not a fundraiser." My mom frowned, clearly torn. "She's just excited," she said. "And yes, her ideas might be a little over the top, but it's her big day. We want to give her what she's always dreamed of." I couldn't hide my frustration. "I get that, Mom, but at what cost? You're talking about dipping into your savings, and she's asking me to contribute money I don't have. It feels like no one's thinking about the long-term impact." My dad sighed heavily. "We've made sacrifices for you and Emily before. This isn't new for us, but we do want you to support her however you can, even if it's not financially." That last part caught me off guard. For a moment, I wondered if they understood my position after all. Still, the underlying message was clear. Family comes first, and they hoped I'd find a way to compromise. I left the conversation feeling conflicted. My parents' intentions were pure, but their willingness to overextend themselves for Emily only made me more determined to protect my own boundaries. Even so, I couldn't ignore the weight of their expectations. That evening, I found myself thinking about everything my parents had done for Emily and me over the years. Their sacrifices were woven into the fabric of our lives, though they rarely talked about them outright. When I was in college, my dad had taken on extra shifts at work to cover unexpected expenses for my tuition. I remembered how tired he'd looked during those months, coming home late, but still asking about my day with a smile. My mom had postponed her plans to start her own small business because she wanted to ensure Emily and I had what we needed growing up. It wasn't just financial sacrifices. They had always gone out of their way to make sure we felt supported. When Emily struggled through a tough breakup a few years ago, my mom spent endless nights comforting her. When I got my first big job interview, my dad was the one who sat with me, practicing potential questions until I felt confident. These memories softened some of the frustration I felt. I understood why they wanted to go all out for Emily's wedding. It wasn't about the event itself, but about showing her how deeply they cared. They'd done it for me too, just in different ways. But as much as I appreciated their generosity, I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in my head. Sacrifices like these came with a cost, one they rarely acknowledged. My dad wasn't getting any younger, and their retirement savings weren't infinite. I knew how much they wanted to keep up this image of unwavering support, but at what point did it become too much? I realized that my frustration wasn't just about Emily's demands. It was about watching my parents take on more than they should. As much as I wanted to protect my own boundaries, I also wanted to protect them from the consequences of overextending themselves. It was a difficult truth to reconcile. Their love for us was limitless, but their resources weren't. Feeling overwhelmed, I decided to talk to a few close friends about everything that had been going on. I needed an outside perspective, someone who wasn't caught in the web of family expectations and emotions. We met at our favorite cafe, and as we settled into our usual corner booth, I laid it all out. Emily's extravagant plans, her request for financial support, and the tension it had created between us. I feel like I'm being backed into a corner, I admitted. I love her, but I can't afford to give what she's asking. And now it feels like I'm the bad guy for saying no. One of my friends, Rachel, leaned forward, her expression empathetic but firm. "You're not the bad guy," she said. "It sounds like Emily's caught up in the fantasy of it all and isn't thinking about the bigger picture. But that's not your responsibility to fix." Another friend, Mark, nodded. "She's putting a lot of pressure on you. It's okay to say no and stick to it. You shouldn't feel guilty for setting boundaries." Their words were comforting, but part of me still felt conflicted. "What about my parents?" I asked. "They're already giving so much, and I feel like if I don't step in, they'll just keep taking on more." Rachel sighed. "That's tough, but again, that's not your burden to carry. They're adults, and they're making their own choices. You can only control what you do." By the end of the conversation, I felt a little lighter. My friends reminded me that standing firm wasn't selfish. It was necessary. Still, the guilt lingered, and I knew that resolving this with Emily and my parents wouldn't be as simple as venting over coffee. A few days later, Emily called and asked if we could talk. I hesitated but agreed, hoping this could be a step toward clearing the air. She came over that evening, and it didn't take long for the conversation to steer toward the wedding. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her tone more measured than it had been during our last argument. "And I get it. You're dealing with your own stuff. But this wedding means so much to me. It's not just a party. It's my dream, something I've imagined since I was a kid." I nodded, giving her space to explain. "When I think about my wedding," she continued, "it's not just about the dress or the venue. It's about creating a day that feels magical, where everyone I love is there to celebrate with me. I want it to be perfect, not just for me, but for Ryan, for our families, for everyone." Her voice cracked slightly, and I could see how much this meant to her. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime thing," she said. "I'm not trying to be selfish, but I just want it to be everything I've ever dreamed of." Her words softened my frustration, but they didn't erase my concerns. "I get that, Emily," I said gently, "and I want you to have that magical day. But don't you think there's a way to make it special without it being so extravagant? You can still have a beautiful wedding without putting so much strain on everyone." She frowned, clearly not ready to budge. "I don't know how to explain it," she said. "It's not just about what it looks like, it's about how it feels. And to get that feeling, some things just aren't negotiable." I realized then that her justification wasn't about money or practicality. It was about emotion. She was chasing an idea of perfection that felt tied to her happiness, her identity, and even her sense of self-worth. While I could empathize with her, it didn't change the fact that her expectations were still unrealistic. Emily's determination only seemed to grow stronger after our conversation. While I had hoped we could find a middle ground, it quickly became clear that she wasn't ready to compromise, not on her vision, and certainly not on her expectations for my involvement. Over the next week, she started dropping more pointed comments, almost as if testing my resolve. When she showed me a brochure for the tropical resort she'd chosen, she casually mentioned how the family could work together to make it happen. "It's really not that much if everyone contributes a little," she said with a hopeful smile. I tried to redirect the conversation, but she pressed on. "I mean, You could always put some of it on a credit card, she suggested, her tone light as if she were offering a simple solution. That was the tipping point for me. Emily, I said firmly, I'm not going into debt for a wedding, even yours. I've been clear about what I can and can't do, and that hasn't changed. Her face fell, but she quickly masked it with frustration. You're acting like I'm asking you to sell a kidney, she said. It's not that big of a deal, and it's not just for me. It's for the whole family to enjoy. I felt my patience wearing thin. It might not seem like a big deal to you, but it is to me, I replied. I'm trying to build a stable future, and I can't sacrifice that for one day, no matter how important it is. Her disappointment turned into something sharper. You're supposed to be my sister, she said, her voice rising. Family is supposed to support each other. But all you care about is yourself. The words stung, but I stood my ground. Supporting you doesn't mean ignoring my own limits, I said. I love you, but this isn't fair. The conversation ended with her walking away, clearly upset. I felt a mix of guilt and resolve, guilt for hurting her, but resolve to protect the boundaries I knew were necessary. A few days after my argument with Emily, my mom called and asked if I could come over. She didn't say much, but her tone carried a weight that I couldn't ignore. When I arrived, she was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea, clearly waiting for me. I just wanted to talk, she began, her voice soft and calm. Things have been tense lately, and I think we need to work this out before it gets worse. I nodded, sitting across from her. I'm not trying to cause tension, Mom, I said. I just can't give Emily what she's asking for. It's not realistic. I know, she said, surprising me. And I understand where you're coming from, but you have to see it from her perspective too. This wedding is so important to her, and she feels like you're not supporting her the way she expected. I sighed, frustrated but trying to keep my tone respectful. It's not that I don't support her. I just can't contribute financially the way she wants. I've offered to help in other ways, but that doesn't seem to be enough for her. My mom took a sip of her tea, her expression thoughtful. Emily has always been idealistic, she said gently. She's not trying to hurt you. She just doesn't fully understand what she's asking, and I think it's hard for her to let go of the vision she's had in her head for so long. I get that, I replied, but her expectations are putting so much pressure on everyone. It's not fair to you and Dad, and it's not fair to me either. My mom reached out and squeezed my hand. We'll figure this out, she said. Just don't let this ruin your relationship with her. That's what matters most. The breaking point came sooner than I expected. Emily had come over to my apartment, and though things started off cordial, the conversation quickly turned back to the wedding. She began talking about a list of additional expenses that had cropped up, transportation for the bridal party, upgraded catering options, and a videographer to capture the entire event. I'm trying to cover as much as I can, she said, flipping through pages of her wedding planner. But there's just so much to think about. I was hoping you could step in for some of the smaller things. The word smaller made me pause. Her version of small expenses still felt monumental to me. Emily, I've already explained where I stand, I said cautiously. Her face tightened, but she kept going. It's just that everyone else is doing their part, she said. Mom and Dad are going above and beyond, and Ryan's family is helping too. It just feels like you're not even trying. That hit a nerve. Not trying? I repeated, my voice rising. Emily, I've offered to help in every way I can, just not financially. That doesn't mean I'm not trying. She didn't back down. It's like you don't care how important this is to me, she shot back. You're making it all about you when this is supposed to be about family. Something in me snapped. This isn't about family. It's about you wanting everyone else to fund your dream, I said, standing up. You're not thinking about what it's costing Mom and Dad, or how much pressure you're putting on me. It's not fair, Emily. The room fell silent. Emily stared at me, her face a mix of shock and anger. If you feel that way, she said coldly, maybe you shouldn't bother coming to the wedding at all. Her words hung in the air like a slap. I watched as she grabbed her bag and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a long moment, feeling a wave of emotions, anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of loss. This was a line I hadn't expected us to cross. The days following Emily's dramatic exit were heavy with silence. She didn't call, didn't text, and for the first time in years, it felt like there was a chasm between us that couldn't be bridged. My parents, caught in the middle, became messengers in a battle neither of us wanted to declare openly. My mom called one evening, her voice soft but strained. "Emily's upset," she said, as if I hadn't already guessed. "She feels like you're not supporting her during such an important time." I let out a deep sigh. "Mom, I've tried explaining this over and over. I'm supporting her in every way I can, but I can't bankrupt myself to meet her expectations." "I know, sweetheart," she replied, her voice tinged with weariness. "But you know how she is. She's always been a little sensitive. She feels like you don't care." "That's not true," I said firmly. "I care deeply, but caring doesn't mean saying yes to everything." My dad chimed in when I visited later that week. "You're both being stubborn," he said, shaking his head. "She's hurt, and now you're digging in your heels. This isn't worth ruining your relationship over." Their words weighed heavily on me, but so did my own sense of principle. Emily's silence felt like a punishment, a way of forcing me to reconsider. But instead of guilt, it sparked frustration. Why couldn't she see things from my perspective? Family dinners became awkward. Emily avoided me entirely, directing all her attention to our parents. It was as though we were living on opposite sides of a war zone, both convinced we were right. The strain was palpable, and though I missed my sister, I wasn't ready to budge. I couldn't tell if I was standing my ground or simply standing alone. After weeks of tension and avoidance, the inevitable confrontation finally came during another family dinner. My parents had invited Emily and me over, clearly hoping to diffuse the situation. But with emotions running high, it didn't take long for the conversation to veer off course. Emily and I were seated across from each other at the table, the silence between us louder than the clinking of silverware. My mom tried to start a lighthearted conversation about wedding details, but it quickly unraveled. "Emily, how's the guest list coming along?" she asked, forcing a cheerful tone. Emily glanced at me briefly before replying, "It's fine, except I've had to cut things back since not everyone is willing to help." I set my fork down, taking a deep breath to steady myself. "Emily, we've been through this," I said. "It's not about willingness. It's about what's realistic." She crossed her arms, her voice sharp. "You keep saying that, but it just sounds like an excuse. Everyone else is making sacrifices, but you're too focused on yourself to care." That was it. I couldn't hold back anymore. "I'm focused on myself because I have to be," I said, my voice rising. "I'm not in a position to take on extra financial burdens right now. That doesn't mean I don't care about you." My dad raised his hands in an attempt to calm things down. "All right, that's enough," he said, but neither of us was ready to stop. "You say you care," Emily shot back, "but actions speak louder than words. If you really cared, you'd find a way to help." I shook my head, trying to keep my tone even. Caring doesn't mean giving in to unrealistic expectations. "I love you, Emily, but I have to draw the line somewhere." The room fell into an uneasy silence. My parents exchanged worried glances but didn't say anything further. Emily pushed her chair back and left the table without another word. As I sat there, I couldn't decide if I'd stood my ground or made things worse. Either way, the gap between us felt wider than ever. In the days following that dinner, guilt began to creep in, gnawing at the edges of my resolve. As much as I believed I was doing the right thing, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was letting my sister down. Emily's parting words echoed in my mind. "If you really cared, you'd find a way to help." It stung, not because I believed it, but because she did. The thought that she saw me as selfish or unloving felt like a failure on my part. I started questioning whether I had been too rigid. Was there a way I could compromise without sacrificing my financial stability? Had I focused too much on the money and not enough on the emotional significance of the day? At the same time, I thought about my parents. They were caught in the middle, trying to please Emily while also keeping the peace between us. I knew they were stressed, even if they weren't saying it outright. Their silence after that dinner spoke volumes, and I couldn't help but wonder if they, too, thought I was being unreasonable. But whenever I considered caving in, I reminded myself of the reasons behind my decision. Saying yes wouldn't just hurt me. It might also enable Emily's pattern of leaning too heavily on others to fulfill her dreams. Deep down, I knew this wasn't just about the wedding. It was about boundaries and setting a precedent for the future. Still, the weight of it all was exhausting. Every text I didn't send to Emily felt like another step away from repairing our relationship. Every call from my mom felt like a reminder of the growing rift in our family. For the first time, I wasn't sure if holding my ground was worth the cost. Feeling overwhelmed and uncertain, I decided to seek outside guidance. I knew I couldn't resolve this situation on my own, and I needed clarity, both emotionally and financially. It started with a meeting with my financial advisor, someone I trusted to give me a clear perspective on what I could realistically afford. During our session, I laid everything out: Emily's wedding plans, her requests, and my own financial situation. My advisor listened patiently before pulling up a detailed breakdown of my finances. "Here's the thing," she said, pointing to a chart on her screen. "Your current budget doesn't leave much room for extras, especially something as significant as contributing to a wedding. If you take on more debt now, you'll only delay your other goals, your emergency fund, savings, and even basic stability." It was validating to hear. While I already knew the numbers in my head, having someone else confirm them made me feel less guilty about my decision. But the emotional side of things was trickier. I scheduled an appointment with a therapist, hoping to untangle the guilt and frustration I was carrying. During our session, I explained the situation, focusing on how torn I felt between wanting to support my sister and needing to protect my own boundaries. "What you're describing," the therapist said, "is a classic conflict between love and limits. You love your sister, but love doesn't mean sacrificing your well-being. Setting boundaries isn't about being selfish. It's about recognizing what you can give without harming yourself." Those words stuck with me. She helped me frame my decision in a way that felt less like a rejection of Emily and more like an act of self-care. By the end of the week, I felt a renewed sense of clarity. While the guilt hadn't completely disappeared, I felt more confident in my choice. Supporting Emily didn't mean agreeing to everything she asked. It meant showing up in ways that were sustainable for me. Armed with the clarity I'd gained from my sessions, I decided to try a different approach. Face-to-face conversations with Emily had only escalated into arguments, so I chose to write her a letter instead. Writing gave me time to carefully articulate my feelings without the heat of the moment clouding my words. I sat at my desk, staring at the blank page for what felt like hours before I finally began. "Dear Emily, I want to start by saying how much I love you and how happy I am for you and Ryan. Seeing you so excited about your wedding has been incredible, and I truly want your day to be everything you've dreamed of. That said, I need to be honest with you about where I'm coming from. I know we've argued about this, and I hate that it's caused so much tension between us. Please believe me when I say it's not about me not caring. It's about what I can realistically do. Right now, I'm working hard to build a stable future for myself. Between paying off student loans and trying to save for my goals, I simply can't contribute financially in the way you're hoping. It's not because I don't want to. It's because I need to make choices that are sustainable for me. I know how much this wedding means to you, and I admire your vision. I want to support you in every way I can, whether it's helping with planning, organizing, or just being by your side through it all. I hope you can understand that my limits don't come from a lack of love, but from a place of self-respect. I hope we can move past this and focus on what truly matters, celebrating your love and our bond as sisters. I miss you, and I want us to find a way back to each other." As I folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope, I felt a strange mix of anxiety and relief. I hoped this gesture would be enough to bridge the gap between us. After delivering the letter, I felt a mix of hope and apprehension. I didn't know how Emily would react, and the waiting was excruciating. Days passed without a word, and I began to wonder if she'd even read it. Finally, late one evening, my phone buzzed with a text from her. "Can we talk?" It was short and simple, but it was enough to get my heart racing. When she came over the next day, she had the letter in her hand. Her expression was softer than it had been in weeks, but there was still a trace of hurt in her eyes. "I read your letter," she began, sitting down across from me. "And I guess I didn't realize how much pressure I was putting on you. I've just been so caught up in everything that I didn't stop to think about what I was asking." Her words were unexpected, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Emily, I never wanted this to turn into a fight," I said. "I just needed you to understand where I'm coming from." She nodded, looking down at the letter. "I do now. I think I just got so focused on making everything perfect that I lost sight of what really matters." She looked up, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry for pushing you. I never wanted to make you feel like you had to choose between supporting me and taking care of yourself. It was the first time we'd truly connected since the tension began, and I felt the weight between us start to lift. I just want to be there for you in the ways I can," I said, "and I want this to be a happy time for both of us." She smiled faintly. "Me too." It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. After our conversation, things between Emily and me began to thaw. It wasn't an instant fix, but there was a noticeable shift in the way we interacted. The tension that had hung between us for weeks seemed to ease, and we started talking about things other than the wedding again. Small, everyday topics that felt like a return to normalcy. Emily sent me a message the next morning that caught me off guard. "I've been thinking about what you said," it read, "and I want to make sure this doesn't come between us anymore. Can we grab coffee soon?" When we met, Emily seemed more reflective than I'd seen her in a long time. Over our drinks, she admitted that she had let her excitement about the wedding overshadow her relationships. "I think I got so caught up in trying to make it perfect," she said, "that I didn't realize I was pushing people away. I hate that I did that to you." I nodded, grateful for her honesty. "I understand why it's so important to you," I said, "and I don't want to take away from your happiness. I just need us to find a balance where we both feel respected." We talked about ways I could help that didn't involve financial contributions, organizing logistics, helping her pick out decor, and even handling some of the smaller planning tasks. "I'd love that," she said with a smile. "Honestly, it'll make me feel better knowing you're part of it in a way that works for you." It felt like we were finally on the same page. While I knew there was still a lot to navigate, the fact that we were communicating openly again gave me hope. As we parted ways, Emily gave me a hug, a rare gesture from her, and said, "Thanks for sticking with me through all of this. I don't know what I'd do without you." Walking away, I realized that this was the connection I'd been fighting for all along, not just as her sister, but as someone she could rely on for more than just money. With things finally starting to smooth over between Emily and me, my parents decided to step in with their own solution. They invited both of us over for dinner, clearly eager to resolve the lingering tension and find a way for the family to move forward together. After we'd eaten, my dad leaned forward, hands clasped on the table. "Your mom and I have been thinking a lot about this," he began, his voice calm but firm. "And we want to make sure everyone feels like they're part of this wedding in a way that works for them." Emily glanced at me, her expression cautious but open. My mom chimed in. "We've decided to take care of the big expenses ourselves. Venue, catering, and some of the other essentials. But we'd love for you, as her sister, to help in other ways that don't involve money." It was a relief to hear them acknowledge the strain, though I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for how much they were taking on. "What do you have in mind?" I asked, trying to sound supportive. "Well," my mom said, "Emily mentioned that you're great at organizing. Maybe you could take charge of coordinating with the vendors or managing the guest list. Things like that would take a big load off her shoulders." Emily nodded, her tone softer than I'd expected. "Honestly, that would help a lot," she said. "I know I've been asking too much, but having you involved in those ways would mean so much to me." I agreed, feeling a sense of relief that we'd found a compromise. My parents seemed visibly lighter, and for the first time in weeks, the four of us sat together without any underlying tension. As I left that evening, I felt hopeful. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was one that allowed everyone to contribute in their own way without overextending themselves. With a clear plan in place, I finally felt like I could contribute to Emily's wedding in a way that was both meaningful and manageable. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the tasks we'd outlined, coordinating with vendors, managing RSVPs, and helping Emily refine her timeline. To my surprise, I actually enjoyed the work. Organizing had always been one of my strengths, and it felt good to be part of the process without the financial pressure hanging over my head. Emily seemed to appreciate it too. She started including me in more discussions, asking for my input on things like color schemes and seating arrangements. "Do you think these centerpieces are too much?" she asked one afternoon, holding up a photo. "They're beautiful," I said, "but maybe consider something simpler. It'll save you money, and I think it'll still look elegant." She actually took my advice, which felt like a small victory. It was a reminder that supporting her didn't have to mean agreeing to everything. Sometimes, offering perspective was just as valuable. As the weeks went on, our relationship began to feel more like it used to, playful, collaborative, and filled with mutual respect. We spent evenings at her place going over details, laughing about how stressful weddings could be. "I don't know how people do this without losing their minds," she said one night, collapsing onto the couch. "It's all worth it in the end," I said, smiling. "You'll see." It felt good to be able to reassure her, not just as her sister, but as someone actively helping to make her vision a reality. And the best part? I was doing it in a way that didn't compromise my own boundaries or financial stability. By the time we finalized the last few details, Emily turned to me with a genuine smile. "I couldn't have done this without you," she said. Seriously, hearing that made all the effort worthwhile. It wasn't the way I'd expected to contribute to her wedding, but it was the way that worked best for both of us. The day of Emily's wedding arrived in a flurry of excitement and nervous energy. The morning was spent with the bridal party, getting ready in a suite overlooking the ocean. Emily was radiant, her hair swept into an elegant updo and her makeup flawless. Watching her slip into her dress, a stunning yet understated gown she'd finally chosen after weeks of deliberation, was a moment that left us all a little teary-eyed. "You look perfect," I said, squeezing her hand as she glanced at herself in the mirror. "Thanks to you," she replied, her voice soft. "I mean it. You've been amazing through all of this." The ceremony was held on the beach, just as she'd dreamed, with the sun dipping low on the horizon and the sound of waves providing a gentle backdrop. It was a small, intimate gathering, not the grand production she had originally envisioned, but it was breathtaking in its simplicity. As Emily walked down the aisle, arm in arm with our dad, I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride and happiness for her. During the reception, I found myself running around, making sure everything went smoothly. I double-checked with the caterers, helped redirect guests to their tables, and even wrangled the photographer for a few last-minute family shots. It was busy, but I didn't mind. Seeing Emily and Ryan laughing together on the dance floor made it all worth it. Later that evening, as the party began to wind down, Emily pulled me aside. "I know we had our differences," she said, her voice sincere, "but I couldn't have asked for a better sister. You made today so much easier, and I'll never forget that." Her words struck a chord. For all the tension we'd faced leading up to this day, it felt like everything had come full circle. As I watched her leave with Ryan under a canopy of sparklers, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't just her wedding day, it was a reminder of the strength of our bond, one that had weathered every challenge and come out stronger. In the days after the wedding, life started to return to normal. The chaos of planning, the tension, and even the arguments felt like distant memories as I reflected on everything we'd been through. Emily and I found ourselves reconnecting in a way that felt deeper than before. The challenges we faced during the wedding planning had forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our relationship, and ultimately, made us stronger for it. One evening, as we sat in her living room flipping through photos from the wedding, Emily turned to me with a smile. "I'm glad we figured things out," she said. "I know I wasn't easy to deal with, and I'm sorry for that. But having you there with me meant more than I can put into words." Her sincerity reminded me why I'd fought so hard to keep our relationship intact. "I'm glad too," I replied. "It wasn't always easy, but it was worth it. You're worth it." We laughed, reminiscing about the mishaps that had happened during the wedding, like when the best man forgot his speech and improvised a hilarious toast that became the highlight of the night. As the months passed, our family also seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm. My parents, though a little lighter in the wallet, were clearly proud of how everything had turned out. They often mentioned how much they appreciated the way Emily and I had come together in the end. Looking back, the entire experience taught me a lot, not just about boundaries, but about love, compromise, and the strength it takes to navigate difficult situations with family. Emily's wedding wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful. And as I moved forward, I felt grateful, not only for the memories we created, but for the bond we'd rebuilt along the way.